Hi everybody, welcome to my tutorials for underwater photography. Today we're going to talk about strobe positioning, which is probably one of the most popular topics I'm asked about online, through social media, and actually in workshops in general. So let's dive right in. Strobe positioning is so important because it allows us to light our foreground subject, which creates a lot of vibrant color, pop, contrast, and a lot of the really compelling elements of the image without creating backscatter. And what we're going to do is talk about backscatter first and what it is and how to minimize backscatter, and then we'll talk about specific strobe positions for macro and wide angle. So, what is backscatter? Backscatter is basically light reflecting off particles in the water. So this is why when you're in a nice tropic destination with 100-foot visibility, it's easier to shoot images without getting any backscatter, and why when you're diving in pea soup with 5 feet of visibility, you might have a lot of backscatter. So think of it like when you're on a boat and you're looking down through the water, you've got great vertical visibility, the sun is high overhead. The sun is going right through those particles. You're not seeing any backscatter. As soon as you get into the water, now you're looking horizontally through the water. You see a lot of backscatter, a lot of particulate. That's because the sun is hitting those particles at, maybe a 90, 120 degree beam angle and coming back at you, and you can see everything in there. So the same principles with our strobes. If there's particles between the strobe, the subject, and the dome port or the macro port of our camera, and we illuminate them, the light is going to reflect off that particle and come back into the camera and create all those white spots that are backscatter that we don't like, because backscatter is our biggest enemy in underwater photography. We don't notice it as much shooting video because all those particles are flying through the scene and nothing's static, but in a still photo we have one frame and one chance to get it right. So basically our goal is to light the subject but not light any extra water in the scene. We want the strobe light or the video light to hit that subject to create that vibrant pop and that color and that contrast and those shadows, but not light the water in front of the subject, on top of the subject, behind the subject, or on the sides. So we really want to light the pieces of the scene that need the artificial light, but nothing else, because as we light more of the scene and any shed extra light into the water, that's where our backscatter lives, and it's going to create a lot more backscatter for us. Naturally, we need light to hit the subject, so in very bad conditions there's nothing you can do, but with the right strobe position we're going to target our light so it hits the subject but nothing else. And with strobes and video lights, you have a beam angle, and the light is coming out of the light head from 100 to 130 degrees. It depends on the type of strobe or the light. And what we're going to do is use the edge of that cone of light to light up the subject. So this way we're using that sharp light fall off to get the subject, and then we'll not be lighting any of that extra water above, behind, to the sides, in front of the subject. So that's our principle with all of these strobe positions, and it's the same effect for macro and wide angle. In wide angle we just have a bigger piece of real estate to work with. We've got more space to deal with, whereas macro has many of the same effects, however everything is much smaller and much more miniature. So let's dive in. Let's start talking about strobe positions. The one important thing to keep in mind is that these are just starting points. So like our camera settings, this is what we want to set up for specific shots and specific scenes and subjects. But depending on that exact shooting situation, we're going to make tweaks to these positions. So these are great starting points, but by no means, don't lock it down and leave it there all dive. Adjust, experiment off of these starting points. So we'll start with wide angle with dual strobe position and then single strobe positioning, and then we'll jump into some macro strobe positions, both for double strobes and then for single strobes. Basic wide angle strobe positioning. So this is my default swim setting when I'm shooting wide angle, and that can be with a fisheye lens, a rectilinear wide angle lens, it can be with a DSLR, it can be with a mirrorless, or even a compact camera, as long as you're not using a macro diopter. If you're using just the camera itself or the camera with a wide angle wet lens, this basic wide angle strobe positioning is the default. It's how I set up every time from when I start the dive until I end the dive. Of course there are adjustments to be made, but there's two main things to keep in mind. The first is to keep your strobes behind the plane of the dome port or behind the plane of the front housing port. Wherever that front glass or acrylic element is, the strobes or the video lights should be behind that. If they're in front of that, you run the risk of getting some glare on that dome port, and that's what we want to avoid. We definitely do not want that glare hitting that. So when the strobes are behind that dome port, then we have a higher probability of getting less backscatter in the frame. The second thing is that because our strobes have that beam angle of 100 to 130 degrees, depending on the make and the model, we want to angle strobes slightly out. And I like to keep my strobes maybe about 12 inches or a foot out from the dome port as a very basic position. So I'll angle the strobes out maybe 20 to 30 degrees because that's a nice beam angle for a subject that's several feet in front of the camera. So 1, keep the strobes back behind the front plane of the dome port, and 2, angle them out slightly as a basic wide angle strobe position. What I also like to do is keep the strobe slightly above the dome port. And you can think of this in terms of shadows, because the other side of the light is shadow. When you hit something with a light source from one end, you're going to have a shadow on the other end. We're used to seeing objects and people with shadows from above, from the sun. So because of that, I generally put the strobes up a little higher. And what that does is it creates a subtlest hint of shadow on the underside of an image. If your strobes are down low, below the camera port, you're going to light the subject from underneath slightly, and that might create shadows on top and just an effect that you might not see right away, but just won't feel quite right. And of course, there's always exceptions to that. Let's say you're shooting sharks in open blue water. Maybe you do want to have the strobes coming lower because you've got nice ambient sunlight on top and the bottom is black in the shadow, so that lower light will light the bottom of the shark. But in general, I like to keep these above and to the side and slightly pointed out. Big animal wide angle strobe positioning or reefscapes. So this is very similar to the basic position, except we're trying to illuminate a bigger scene. Maybe it's a huge manta ray or a huge reefscape. So there's 2 things. 1, we'll pull the strobes out further away because we want to illuminate the whole scene. And now because the strobes are farther, we're going to have more dispersed light across everything in front of us. And 2, because the strobes are so far away, we don't necessarily need to have them pointed as aggressively out as in close to the housing. Notice when I have the strobes in close here for close focus, I'll slowly rotate the strobes slightly forward so that they're still pointed out, but it's not as aggressive as when the strobes are in close to the housing. So we want to make sure that the strobes are behind the front plane of the port, out wide, and pointed out slightly for these large subjects to disperse the light. Close focus wide angle. And we touched on this before, but when we have a subject very close to the front dome port, we want the strobes in very close and pointed a lot farther out. So they'll have a much more extreme angle away from the subject because we have much less water between the front of the dome port and the subject. So strobes in close and strobes pointed very far out. Again, behind the front plane of the dome port, we never want to get in front of that because of nasty reflections on the dome port. If, for instance, we are shooting a sunburst or something, we want to have the strobes in very close as well because we've stopped down our settings, there's not much light coming into the camera, so we'll put these strobes in very, very close. White sand strobe positioning. So this is a tricky one because if we use our regular strobe position, then we will be lighting up a lot more of the sand in front of the subject before we hit the subject and have the light come back to us. So the sand that's just in front of the camera is going to have a lot less distance for the light to travel, and it's going to be brighter and most likely overexposed because we're on white sand. So the trick for shooting on white sand is to move the strobes up very high above the camera. So you're almost like some sort of extraterrestrial or animal like this with a long antenna, but what you're doing is you're lighting that sand in front of the camera dome port and the subject more evenly than if you're lighting it from this perspective and creating a hot spot right in front. So as you lift these strobes up, again, they can be angled slightly out, so we're only using the cone of light, but we're lighting the sand between the dome and the subject evenly, which should eliminate or minimize those hot spots. Portrait orientation. So all we have to do to shoot a portrait is flip the camera 90 degrees sideways. And the thing to remember is oftentimes we'll flip the camera 90 degrees sideways and you've got one strobe way up high, one strobe down low, And like we mentioned before, we don't want those nasty Halloween shadows coming from underneath the subject. So real simple, all we do is move the strobes to be roughly on the side. So even though we're shooting in portrait orientation, we've got our basic strobe positioning with the strobes on the side. Notice they're behind the front plane of the dome port and they're angled slightly out to use just that cone of light. So these can be different positions. Maybe you want to have one strobe above and to the side like this for portrait. Maybe you want to try and reverse it, have one strobe above here and this one over to this side. There's really no right or wrong with that. You can adjust the strobes as needed depending on the type of subject. Single strobe positioning. So if you're working with a single strobe, we're using all the same principles. We're still using just the corner of the beam of light of the strobe or the video light, but what we're doing is we're positioning this more above the camera. And you can have this position very straightforward for wide angle above, or what I like to do is generally move it to 1 o'clock or 11 o'clock. So you still have this upward angle, the light is coming mostly from above with your subject, but you are creating a little bit of hint of shadow on either side of the subject. So depending what direction the subject is facing, you might want to pick a different side for this general up position. If you're shooting with the subject specifically on the left, like let's say a sea fan here, and then you've got open blue water, a dive buddy or something in the background, maybe you want to bring the strobe back over here. So now you're lighting just that sea fan. Again, none of the extra water or anything. We've got the strobe behind the front plane of the dome port, but you're lighting the fan and nothing else. On the left, if it's on the right side, move it over. And I like to put the strobe on the left so that I use my right hand to shoot and hold the camera, and the left can move the strobe very easily. If you're shooting something big, like let's say it's a manta ray swimming by, I always like to put the strobe on the side that has the face of the shark, the ray, whatever it is. So if it's swimming from right to left through the frame, the left side of the frame is where the subject's face is going to be. So I'll put my strobe out, pretty wide here on the left side. And that way the artificial light is going to illuminate the face of the subject. If they swim from left to right through the frame, I'm going to grab the strobe, I'm going to put it over here. So now I'm lighting the front of the subject, the face, as it's swimming left to right through the frame. So I'm constantly thinking about where to position this single light source to make the most of the image and really illuminate the most important part of the frame. Basic macro strobe positioning. So the principles for macro are pretty much the same as wide angle, just on a smaller scale. We want to light the subject of the image with the light using the cone of the beam of light, but also not light the space between the front of the dome port and the subject, the water on the sides, above or behind the subject. So we're finally controlling that light through our strobe positioning to minimize backscatter while lighting the subject. So as a general macro swim setting, if we're swimming around the reef, maybe following a guide, we're not sure what we're going to see, I will actually use a very similar position to the basic wide angle position. The strobes are behind the front plane of the macro port, just because it'll help us to reduce backscatter, and the strobes will be angled slightly out, again because the beam of light, that cone, is going to want to light the subject but not the space between the port and the subject. So with the strobe positioning, I'm ready for anything. Something really quick could happen. Maybe you're swimming, looking at a nudibranch, saying, hey, should I shoot a photo of this? And a guide tugs your fin and goes, woo, 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 and there's blue ring octopus mating. You just don't know. So you want to be ready for anything. Something could be swimming by you at any point. So this is my go-to setting for macro. And then if you do get that whale that swims by and you want to shoot the whale eye because you're with a macro lens instead of wide angle lens, at least you have a chance. Close macro strobe positioning. Now, this is a really interesting technique, and it really helps us control light and minimize backscatter, especially if you're trying to shoot black backgrounds. So instead of shooting with my strobes out like this, where I'm illuminating this much of the frame, what I'm going to do is take the strobes, pull them in close, and turn them in. And now what I'm doing is I'm shining most of this strobe light on the housing port itself. And I'm not talking about taking the strobe and facing it back and shooting into the lens. And no, it's not pointing completely 180 degrees back towards me because the light's not going to hit the subject. But they are pointed a little more than 90 degrees. So they're facing the camera port. and they are lighting that port and the housing. And what we're going to see is that the edge of this cone of light is lighting that subject that's really close in front of the port while not lighting anything else. So that gives us our black background and finely controlled light when we have a subject really close. Sometimes I'll have mine on the side, and sometimes I will position them slightly above the housing like this so that the strobes are angled down and in. And what that does is it just really controls the light above the subject. It points it all down, and the light is coming from the side to the subject. So you're going to light that and keep that nice crisp black background above the subject. So those are my main positions for that. Supermacro strobe positioning. So now we've got our diopter on the front of the camera port, and this is when we're going to work with the same macro principles for backscatter and strobe positioning, but on an even smaller scale. So what I'm going to do is use the close strobe positioning, and I'll have the strobes pointed in back towards the camera port and the diopter in front, but they're going to be even closer, and the amount of beam angle going in front is going to be even less, because now we're shooting with such a small working distance on the diopter that it's a couple inches, a few centimeters right here, that it's a small scale. So the strobes are really pointing very much back towards the diopter, as you can see, and that is illuminating just the subject, but none of the water behind it or on top of it on a very, very small super macro scale. White sand strobe positioning. So this is very similar to the white sand strobe position we used for wide angle because the same principle applies. When we're shooting from the side of the camera, we're going to illuminate all the white sand immediately in front of the port while trying to illuminate the subject and create hot spots. We'll probably even burn out all of that sand there. It's going to be just white with no data in the image, and our image will be ruined because of that white sand. The light will be a lot more intense here than it is back here. So what we want to do is try and make the light hit all that sand surface evenly by bringing the strobes up above the macro port. So when they're up like this, we're lighting that sand evenly from the front of the port to the subject, and we have the same position here. The strobes are pointed slightly out so that, again, we're lighting just the amount of the subject that we need without any extra water space. Macro portrait orientation. So this is very similar to our wide angle portrait orientation. When you flip the camera 90 degrees, flip those strobes back 90 degrees so that the light is again coming from the side. And you can use the basic macro strobe positioning, or you can use the close macro strobe positioning where your subject is closer to the port and the strobes are turned inward. So you can experiment. And same thing with wide angle, you can have one strobe to the side and one on top. Or you could do it the opposite way, one strobe on this side and the other strobe on top. So it really depends where your subject is and which way they're facing, but by going portrait, you should use all the same lighting principles. Okay, and for cracks and holes in the rock and things like that, we talk about angling our strobes out so that we don't create backscatter, but this is an exception to that rule, because if you have a moray eel in a crack, maybe what you do is you put the strobe directly overhead and just shine it right in. So it's sort of like our single strobe position. You'll have the light up top and slightly angled to the right or slightly to the left and shoot into that crack just like that. And finally, single strobe macro position. Similar to wide angle yet again, we're going to put the strobe over the top of the housing, and we'll have it roughly in the center. Again, I like to shoot at either 1 o'clock or 11 o'clock because that's going to create a little hint of shadow on one side or the other. Generally, I'll move the strobe to the side that has the subject's face on it so that I'm illuminating more of the face, and any shadows will fall behind the face towards the back of the subject. So I'll be here generally with the strobe painting facing forward, and you can try with the back position, the close macro position, just turn that strobe back and that cone of light is still going to hit right here. So you're still good to go. If you have a subject that's very much on the side, experiment. Move it far down here, but just remember that you're going to have shadows on this side, or move it over to the other side and shoot from this side, maybe at a 45-degree angle here, pull the strobe back. So really just experiment. It's going to depend on the exact orientation of the subject and the effect you're looking for, where you want that light to come from and where you want the shadow to fall. The nice thing about macro and super macro with a single strobe is that the subject is so small. So because you've got such a wide light source and you've got maybe a nudibranch that's a ½ centimeter across, you're going to do a great job just lighting the whole thing with one light source, whether it's your strobe or your video light. And there we have it, strobe positioning for underwater photography. The thing to keep in mind is that these are just frames of reference. So they're guides, but not the end all, because each shooting situation is gonna take different tweaks for all these positions. They're basic guidelines. So when I'm shooting, I'll use these positions, but I'll be constantly adjusting and moving the strobes to either side of the housing back and forth, because that's what it calls for in those shooting situations. So keep this in mind, be very conscious of where your strobes are positioned, where backscatter could be created, where it's being created when you're reviewing your images, and how to correct that. So always be thinking about that balance between lighting the subject from the right angles and backscatter, and you're going to be well on your way to creating your own strobe positions and really creating excellent images with that vibrancy, that pop, that color, that contrast that works really well. So thanks for watching. As always, please feel free to reach out with any questions, brent@brentdurand.com, and enjoy the rest of the video tutorial series. Thanks.